Have you ever had the feeling that you're starting to lose interest in almost everything? Not a breakdown, not intense suffering, just that the things that once mattered to you no longer reach you. Work, goals, relationships, even old dreams. Everything slowly turns pale, and you begin to wonder, what's disappearing? Is it interest, or is it an old version of you quietly withdrawing? According to Carl Jung, this is exactly the moment when people are most likely to misunderstand themselves. The world often labels this state a crisis, a loss of motivation, a sign that something needs to be fixed. But Jung saw it in the opposite direction. When you begin to lose interest in everything, it doesn't necessarily collapse. It's a sign that your psychological energy no longer wants to invest in the old way of living. In this video, we'll talk about why the feeling of not being interested in anything anymore appears, what it's signaling in your inner life, and why Jung saw this not as an ending, but as the quiet beginning of a deeper transformation. If you're in this state, this video may not be here to push you to get up faster. It may help you understand why you're stopping. Are you ready to step into this journey? Let's begin. Number 1. When you start losing interest in everything, but you haven't collapsed. There are phases in life that don't look like a crisis at all, yet they make you feel as if you're slipping out of your own life. You don't break. You don't lose control. You don't fall into despair. Everything keeps running, even fairly smoothly. You still work, you still smile at the right moments, you still fulfill your responsibilities. There's only one thing that's hard to put into words. You no longer feel pulled toward any of it. The interest doesn't vanish suddenly, it withdraws slowly, soft enough to make you doubt your own feelings, but clear enough that you can't ignore it forever. What makes this state especially uncomfortable is that it doesn't have a familiar name. You can't say you're sad, because sadness usually has an object. You also can't say you're completely empty, because you still feel, still think, still exist. You just sense that you're living with only a small part of yourself. The rest seems to step back, silent, watching. And when there's no specific incident to cling to, the ego begins to panic. It wants a reason, a diagnosis, a clean explanation. But what you're going through doesn't follow that familiar logic. In Jungian psychology, this is a very delicate moment, and it's often misunderstood. Jung didn't see a human being as a fixed structure, but as a living process. He believed our psychic energy is always moving, always searching for somewhere to flow. When a form of life, a role, or a way of defining yourself no longer fits, that energy won't continue to nourish it. And when that happens, the first sensation that shows up in consciousness often isn't pain, it's loss of interest. You're no longer absorbed. You no longer feel it's necessary. You no longer feel yourself there. I know someone named Oliver. He works in urban planning. His job revolves around designing living spaces for communities, balancing infrastructure, the environment, and human needs. Oliver is an idealist. He chose this profession not for money, but for the feeling that he was contributing to something meaningful. For many years he worked with deep dedication. But then, in a period when everything on the outside was stable, Oliver began to feel a strange distance from his own work. He still completed projects, still debated professionally, and still received high evaluations. But the feeling of, "This is where I belong," was gone. What confused Oliver was that he didn't really want to quit. and he didn't have a clear new direction either. He only knew that he no longer felt alive inside that role. There was no hatred, only a gradual cooling. By ordinary standards, it would be easy to conclude that he was losing motivation or needed rest. But Jung would view this phenomenon through a different lens. He would say that perhaps a psychological structure had completed its task, and energy was withdrawing to prepare for another structure, one that had not yet formed clearly. Jung once said something crucial that reflects this state precisely. The ego is only the center of consciousness, not the center of the whole personality. When the deeper parts of the psyche begin to shift, the ego will feel as if it's losing control. And because the ego no longer receives the familiar signals of interest, ambition, or motivation, it interprets that silence as a problem. But from Jung's perspective, this silence is not empty. It's full of inner movement. When energy is no longer poured outward to maintain an image, a role, or an old goal, it turns inward. And because we aren't taught how to listen to the inner life, this experience is easily mistaken for collapse. In truth, it may be a necessary withdrawal of the ego, making room for something deeper to take shape. To make it easier to picture, imagine the lighting system in a theater. When the performance ends, the stage lights go out. Someone sitting in the audience might think everything has finished, but behind the stage, activity continues. Props are removed, scenery is taken down, the space is prepared for another play. Losing interest is like those stage lights turning off. It signals that one performance has completed. Not to end the story, but to prepare for what comes next. What matters in this phase is this: you haven't collapsed. The fact that you can still recognize that you're losing interest and still observe that change is itself a sign that your consciousness is still functioning. Jung clearly distinguished pathological disintegration from transformative withdrawal. In pathological disintegration, a person loses the capacity for reflection. In transformative withdrawal, a person remains lucid, but is no longer identified with what once defined them. Oliver didn't make a big decision immediately. He didn't leave his job. He didn't search for a new identity to replace the old one. The first thing he did was simply admit he was no longer living fully inside the old role. And for Jung, that admission was already an important step. Because when you dare to look directly at the loss of interest without rushing to label it as wrong, you stop completely identifying with the old ego. Many people try to fill this phase with busyness, with new goals, by forcing themselves to return to normal. But Jung warned that when the unconscious is asking for a restructuring, forcing the ego to continue as before only deepens the inner conflict. Not every emptiness needs to be filled. Some emptiness must be left intact so that something new can form naturally. This part of the journey doesn't require you to know who you will become. It only asks that you be honest enough to admit that you no longer want to live the old way. Loss of interest, in Jung's light, is not a personal failure. It's a sign that a cycle has completed and energy is looking for its next path. If you're in this state, perhaps what matters most right now is not action, but listening. Allow yourself to stay with the feeling instead of rushing to fix it. And if what you just heard touches your own experience, leave a short comment. I'm recognizing this sign. Sometimes, simply naming what's happening is already the first step into a deeper transformation. Number 2. The world's biggest misunderstanding about this state. When you step out of the first part of the journey, where you realize you're losing interest, but you haven't collapsed, you immediately run into an invisible wall. That wall isn't inside you. It's in the way the world sees this state. Right here, the biggest misunderstanding begins to form, and if you don't recognize it, many people will turn their backs on the most important sign of their lives. Long before psychology existed, myth described this phase with precision. In Norse mythology, there is a story of Odin hanging himself on the tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights. During that time, Odin did not eat, did not drink, did not act like a powerful god. He hung suspended between life and death, between sky and earth, no longer belonging to the familiar world of the gods. If seen through ordinary eyes, Odin at that time was weakening, destroying himself. But myth understands more than that. It was precisely in that state, stripped of all surface power, that Odin received the deepest knowledge of the runes. Before becoming the god of wisdom, he had to pass through a phase of complete disconnection from the familiar world. Myth does not treat that phase as failure. It treats it as a rite of transformation. But if Odin lived in the modern world, people might rush to pull him down from the tree, insisting he had a problem, that he needed to return to normal life. And this is where myth and modern society split. Myth understands that there are phases when the soul must withdraw from the surface world. Modern society has no patience for that. The world's biggest misunderstanding about losing interest is this: the world treats it as an error to be fixed, while Jung saw it as a signal to be listened to. We live inside a value system that worships constant motion. You must want more, do more, move forward. Interest is treated as proof of health. And when interest disappears, the conclusion becomes almost automatic: something is wrong. No one stops to ask whether that problem is truly a problem at all. Jungian psychology goes against that reflex. Jung believed not every uncomfortable state is pathological. Some states are an indispensable part of inner development. When a person has lived too long inside one form, the loss of interest doesn't arrive to destroy them. It arrives to prevent them from continuing to live inside a structure that has run out of meaning. But society isn't designed to recognize that nuance. It only sees the disruption. Jung once wrote a sentence that is brief, direct, and completely accurate: neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. This touches on the misunderstanding the world commonly makes. Many times, people do not allow themselves to go through the legitimate pain of transformation. They don't allow themselves to lose interest, lose direction, lose certainty. And when that legitimate pain is refused, it returns as symptoms. What matters is that the world often reacts only when symptoms appear, not to the earlier signal. In that context, loss of interest is treated like an enemy. People rush to regain motivation, reclaim inspiration, return to their old version. But Jung would ask a very different question. What if that old version has already completed its role? What if trying to return is only a way of delaying a necessary change? This is the point where the world and Jung move in completely different directions. From a psychological view, when you begin to lose interest in everything, what is happening is not a drop in energy. It is a shift of energy. Energy no longer flows into old goals, roles, or structures. And because the ego can only recognize energy when it is directed outward, it interprets this withdrawal as a deficit. But the unconscious does not see it that way. For the unconscious, this is preparation. Think of this misunderstanding like a fever. A fever isn't the illness, it's the body's natural response as it fights something. But if you focus only on suppressing the fever and ignore the cause, you can weaken the body further. Loss of interest is the same. It's the psyche's response to a deeper contradiction. But the world treats it as the cause that must be eliminated. And that reversal is why so many people get stuck. Modern society is especially prone to this misunderstanding because it fears emptiness. Emptiness produces no immediate results. Emptiness can't be displayed. Emptiness has no measurable metrics. But Jung understood that inside emptiness, the most important movements are taking place. When a person is no longer interested in everything, it may be the moment they no longer want to keep living on the surface. And the surface world always finds that suspicious. Another subtle point the world often misses is this: not everyone who loses interest is falling apart. Some people are very lucid in this state. They can observe their own change. They can sense that something is ending, even if they don't yet know what will begin. Jung saw this capacity for observation as a sign of a healthy transformation process. But society has no room for that in between states. It wants quick answers, quick action, quick conclusions. The biggest lesson in this part is not that you must change your life, it's that you must change your understanding. Understand that when you begin to lose interest in everything, it isn't necessarily a signal that you're going the wrong way. It may be a signal that you have gone far enough within a certain form of life. And when you stop treating this state as a deviation that must be corrected, only then do you become calm enough to go deeper into what is truly happening inside you. Number 3, soul energy withdraws from the old ego. So what is really happening beneath the surface when you no longer want to cling to the things that once mattered so much? At this stage, we begin to look directly at a quiet but profound movement of the psyche. According to Carl Jung, loss of interest is not random or weak. It's a sign that soul energy is withdrawing from the old ego, even if everything on the outside has not yet collapsed. Jung called this vital force libido. In Jungian psychology, libido is not only instinctual energy or desire, it is the entire psychic life force. The thing that makes you care, attach, invest emotionally, and feel, this is my life. When libido flows into a job, the job feels meaningful. When it flows into a role, you live fully inside that role. When it flows into an image of yourself, you believe, this is who I am. But Jung emphasized something crucial. Libido is not loyal to the ego. It has no duty to keep nourishing structures that have completed their function. It is loyal to the wholeness of the personality. So when the old ego no longer reflects the deeper needs of who you are, libido begins to withdraw. Not loudly, not with warnings, not necessarily through a crisis, but through gradual cooling. You still do familiar things, but you no longer feel supplied with energy. You still show up, but you don't feel present. And the ego, which is used to being fed by goals, recognition, and a sense of control, interprets that silence as deficiency, as weakening, as something wrong. From Jung's perspective, this is not a loss of energy, it is energy changing direction. Imagine a long-lived garden tree. For many seasons, sap is poured into the large branches that have borne fruit. But at a certain point, If those branches keep being fed, the whole tree will exhaust itself. A gardener understands that pruning is needed, so the sap withdraws from old branches and nourishes new buds. To an outsider, pruning looks like destruction. But to someone who understands the rhythm of a tree's life, it is the condition for life to continue. Libido withdrawing from the old ego is like that. Not to empty you, but to stop you from continuing to spend your life force on structures that have already completed their purpose. Jung once said something brief and exact that strikes the heart of this phenomenon. Whatever is rejected from the self appears in the world as an event. For many people, that experience is precisely the feeling of losing interest in what once mattered most. The subtle point here is that this withdrawal is not a conscious choice. You don't decide to lose interest. It happens before you can understand it. And because of that, fear appears. You fear you're losing something precious. But Jung would say, if the energy has withdrawn, then that is no longer the right place to keep you. The ego often resists this phase. It wants to pull everything back to how it was. It tries to force itself to become interested again, to feel motivated, to keep wanting what is familiar. But Jung believed inner development doesn't happen when the ego keeps absolute control. It happens when the ego learns to make room. And libido withdrawing from the old ego is the most natural way for that to happen, without coercion, without destruction. In a Jungian therapy session I once observed, there was a woman in her 40s named Miriam, working in corporate law. She didn't come because of pressure or failure, but because of a vague feeling. She no longer felt present inside her own words, even though externally she remained sharp and successful. The therapist asked gently, "What in you is no longer allowed to exist?" Miriam realized she had lived too long inside the image of someone who must always be strong and certain. A softer part, a part that did not yet know, had been pushed aside, and soul energy no longer flowed into that old image. Seeing this didn't deliver an answer, but it brought relief. It wasn't that she was broken. It was that the old form was no longer wide enough. What makes this stage painful is not the withdrawal of energy, it is the resistance. When you force yourself to keep wanting what no longer nourishes you, you are dragging libido back into a structure that has run dry. Jung saw that as living against the psyche's natural process. And the price is often deep exhaustion, prolonged dullness, or an increasingly clear sense of meaninglessness. Jung did not treat this phase as pathology. He treated it as a threshold of transformation. But he was also very realistic in admitting that if it is not understood correctly, this threshold can become a major source of suffering. Not because it is wrong, but because people are not taught how to stay with it. Practically speaking, what matters now is not rushing to find a new goal or forcing yourself back into the old state, but allowing yourself to stay with the withdrawal, gently noticing where your energy no longer flows, the roles that once fed you but are now silent, the things you still hold only out of familiarity rather than life. You don't need to explain it, and you don't need to fix it right away. You only need to be honest with the feeling that you are no longer being touched from the inside. For Jung, the very moment of losing interest is the sign that a form of life has completed its role. Thank you for coming with me to the halfway point of this journey, a stretch that is no longer comfortable but very truthful. If you feel safe enough, share in the comments one thing you've realized you no longer want to continue as before. Sometimes, naming the experience is already a deep transformation, and in the next part, we will step into an even deeper layer of this process, where the old ego doesn't only lose energy, it begins to dissolve, opening a new space for the person you are quietly becoming. Number 4. The dark night of the soul and the dissolution of the persona. When soul energy has withdrawn from the old ego, but the new has not yet appeared, a person enters a very particular territory of experience. Here, familiar motivations no longer have the strength to push you forward, but there is no new direction yet to hold. Loss of interest at this point isn't ordinary boredom. It is deeper, more elusive. You don't just stop wanting to do what is familiar. You begin to feel like a stranger inside your own familiar life. In Jungian psychology, this state is linked to the dissolution of the persona. The persona is the psychological face you use to appear before the world. Your social roles, your manner, the way you speak, the way you learn to adapt, to be accepted, and to feel safe. Jung did not see the persona as negative. On the contrary, he believed it is a necessary structure, like a language that helps a person live within a community. Without a persona, a person would struggle to survive in a complex social life. In this context, Jung said something very blunt. The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. Jung did not deny the persona's function. He simply pointed out its limits. When the persona is used as a tool, it helps you live in the world. But when it becomes the place where you deposit your entire identity, then when it loses its power, emptiness becomes unavoidable. Literature touched this state long ago. In Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa wakes up and discovers he has transformed into an alien creature. But what makes the story haunting is not the transformation itself. It's that Gregor gradually loses every role that once defined him: worker, son, someone useful. When those roles collapse, he is not only rejected by the world around him, he also loses the frame through which he understood himself. Jung would see in this image a clear symbol of the persona's dissolution. When the social mask no longer works, a person falls into a darkness where every old definition loses its meaning. When life energy still flows into the persona, you feel like you are in the right role. You know where you stand in this life. You can lean on the world's feedback, on familiar standards, on achievements, responsibilities, or social position to sense your own existence. But when that energy begins to withdraw, the persona is no longer lit from within. You still wear it, still perform the familiar roles, but they become hollow, without vitality, without real connection. And that very moment opens what many traditions call the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul rarely arrives as a dramatic event. It doesn't necessarily come with tears or obvious despair. Most of the time, it comes quietly. What disappears first is not joy, but the light of definition. The things that once made you feel right no longer reach you. The things that once frightened you no longer have enough force to keep you. You are standing in an in-between space where old answers no longer work, but new answers have not yet formed. From a scientific angle, this experience is not vague at all. When long-established habits and meaning networks tied to social identity begin to weaken, the brain enters a temporary state of instability. People can feel empty, anxious, disoriented. But the paradox is that this instability creates the conditions for deep restructuring. If the old patterns do not loosen, the new patterns have no room to form. Jung intuited this early, when he believed every psychological transformation must pass through a phase of chaos. You can picture this experience like moving to a new city. Nothing has gone wrong, but the streets are no longer familiar. The habits that once made you feel you belonged no longer work. How you introduce yourself, how you fit in, the roles that once held you steady, suddenly feel out of place. Not because you did something wrong, but because the context has changed. The dark night of the soul is like that. You are still you, but the old ways of living no longer connect you to the world the way they used to. At this stage, emptiness doesn't come from not knowing where to go. It comes from the places that once supported your sense of value withdrawing. When the persona loses its power, the familiar frame you used to recognize yourself also fades. You may feel less defined, less anchored, without a role to hold. And naturally, an urge appears to quickly build another image to regain stability. A new role, a new story about yourself can temporarily restore the feeling that I'm someone again. But if you rush to fill that emptiness, the dark night only changes shape. It doesn't truly end. You only change masks. You do not yet touch what needs to be seen. Jung believed that this haste is why many people remain stuck in the dark night for a long time, even while they think they are moving forward. When you begin to lose interest in many things during this phase, it is not a breakdown. It is a sign that old motivations no longer nourish the person you are becoming. It is not that life has lost meaning. It is that old meanings have completed their function. When you do not rush to cling, and you do not rush to replace, an emptiness opens. The deeper meaning of this dark night is not how long you endure it, but how you stay with the emptiness. When you stop trying to return to normal, stop forcing yourself to keep playing roles that are no longer true, you create a new space. In that space, something more truthful has the chance to appear. Not loud, not immediately clear, but with a depth and durability that the old images never had. And from this quiet, the journey begins to shift. It is no longer centered on what you have lost. It slowly turns toward a different question. What inside you truly want to live when you no longer have to wear any mask at all? Number 5. Individuation, when losing interest becomes a doorway to rebirth. At this point, the journey is no longer about what you have lost. It quietly begins to reveal another truth. Loss of interest is not meaningless emptiness. It is a space being cleared for a new way of living. When you are no longer pulled toward the things that once mattered, it is not because you have become cold or depleted. It is because another center within you is slowly beginning to take the lead. For Jung, this is the moment individuation truly begins. For Jung, individuation is not a decision, and it is not an achievement. It is the soul's natural process when a person no longer lives entirely through structures borrowed from the outside. The paradox is that individuation rarely begins with excitement. It begins with withdrawal. When you no longer feel the need to participate in everything. When you no longer feel driven to prove yourself, to keep up, to achieve. Not because you become indifferent, but because your energy has stopped investing in directions that no longer nourish life within you. In daily life, this moment can look ordinary. Someone still goes to work, still fulfills responsibilities, but no longer feels they are living for that work. Someone still maintains relationships, but no longer strains to fit. The things that once thrilled them now feel neutral, not intensely painful, not completely empty. Just a clear feeling, I no longer want to continue the way I used to. And that not wanting, according to Jung, is the sign that the unconscious has begun to lead. Jung believed a person cannot enter individuation while still overly fascinated by the surface world. As long as you are still stimulated by success, image, recognition, you have no reason to stop. That is why loss of interest is not a system error. It is the soul's corrective mechanism. It forces you to slow down, forces you to loosen your grip, so you can hear the subtler movements unfolding underneath. Individuation does not require you to know what you want next. In fact, it begins precisely when you no longer know what you want in the old way. Jung saw this phase as the moment the ego learns to step back, making room for the self, the deeper center of the whole psychic life. The self does not issue commands. It does not draft plans. It reveals itself through small but lasting changes. You can no longer tolerate what you once accepted. You become more sensitive to what is false. You need silence more than before. Jung summed up the spirit of this process in a sentence: "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But becoming who you truly are is not about adding a new identity. It is the process of stripping away what is no longer true. And loss of interest is the first sign that the stripping is already happening. When you stop being captivated by old patterns, you also stop letting them unconsciously steer your life. Imagine someone who has lived for years in a room with bright lights always on. That light makes everything clear, easy to classify, easy to control. But it also washes out subtle details. Then one day, the light begins to soften. Not turning off, just lowering. At first, the person feels uncomfortable. Nothing looks as sharp as before. But as their eyes adapt, gentle lines, shadows, subtle transitions begin to emerge. Individuation is like that. When the harsh light of old goals and old images fades, you begin to see parts of yourself that were previously hidden. A common misunderstanding is that individuation pulls a person away from the world. In fact, Jung saw individuation as a way of returning to the world more truthfully. When you no longer live entirely to meet expectations, you do not need to defend yourself constantly. You do not need to pretend you are certain when you are not. You do not need to like what no longer reaches you. And that lack of strain makes your presence more real, even if it is quieter. At this stage, psychic energy is no longer scattered. It becomes selective. You may do fewer things, but what you do carries the feeling of being in the right place. Not right by outer standards, but right by a deep inner fit. Jung saw this as a sign that the self is gradually becoming the coordinating center, rather than an ego built from social adaptation. The rebirth Jung spoke of does not happen as a single blazing moment. It happens as a quiet rearrangement. What no longer fits falls away on its own. What is true begins to rise without force. And here, loss of interest is no longer an enemy. It becomes a door that does not open onto a completely different life, but onto a different relationship with yourself. When you look back, you may realize that the moment you stopped wanting to cling to everything the way you used to was the moment you began to live from the inside out, instead of from the outside in. You no longer need life to constantly stimulate you to feel alive. You begin to sense life at a deeper level, slow, quiet, but weighty. And if there is one thing to keep from this ending, it is the shift in understanding. When you begin to lose interest in everything, you may not be getting lost. You may be standing before a rare threshold where life is no longer measured by busyness or excitement, but by how closely it matches the truth within you. Individuation does not promise an easier life, but it offers something far deeper, the feeling that you no longer have to live against yourself. And sometimes, that is the most silent, most radical rebirth of all. As this journey closes, what remains is not a complete answer, but a different state forming inside you. In Jung's view, loss of interest is no longer something to fight or hurry to repair. It is a sign that you have lived long enough inside an old shape, long enough for the soul to begin withdrawing from what is no longer true, and preparing for another way of being, deeper and more authentic. Not everything that leaves is a loss. Some things fall away only so you will not keep living by inertia. When familiar motivations lose their pull, it does not mean life has become meaningless. It only shows that a different order is quietly forming, no longer built on roles, images, or expectations that have completed their mission. If this video touched you, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Not to hunt for more motivation, but as a way to mark that you have recognized a movement, very faint, but very real inside you. The next pieces of content will continue in this rhythm, slow, deep, and honest with the inner journey. Thank you for staying until the end. And no matter how the road ahead unfolds, I hope you continue without having to leave yourself behind.